The first time I ever saw him again was inside that courtroom. I was 32 years old, and after years of hiding in the shadows, I finally had a reason to walk into the one place I swore I'd never return to. My name is Daniel Cole, though back then, very few people knew who I really was. To them, I was just another man in the back row of a crowded courtroom, sitting quietly, watching the trial unfold. But for me, it was a homecoming, a return to a stage I had once been forced to abandon. The air was heavy with the usual blend of polished wood, old paper, and the faint musk of nerves. Lawyers shuffled their notes. A bailiff cleared his throat. Jurors shifted in their chairs, ready to be pulled into a story they barely understood. Then the door opened at the far end, and Judge Henry Whitaker walked in, his black robe trailing behind him like a shadow. He looked older than I remembered, lines carved deeper into his face, hair thinned and streaked with gray. Yet his posture still carried that same arrogant authority, the kind of presence that made people feel small without him saying a word. For a moment, he seemed untouchable, a man who had lived his whole career believing no one would ever question his power. But the second his eyes fell on me, that illusion shattered. His steps faltered. His voice caught on the routine greeting he had likely spoken thousands of times. Court is now in session. His lips trembled as if the words had been dragged out against his will. The entire room noticed the strange pause, though they didn't understand it. They didn't know what I knew. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let him see me. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something colder, fear. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple, betraying the calm facade he struggled to maintain. No one else in the room knew what had just happened, but I did. And so did he. The years hadn't erased me from his memory. Not after what he'd done. My sister, Emily, would have been 29 this year. She should have been here, sitting beside me, whispering jokes into my ear as she always did when life got too heavy. But she wasn't here. Because of him. Judge Henry Whitaker, respected, honored, even revered in some circles, had buried the truth about what happened to her. He had locked her story in a vault of lies and sealed it shut with the weight of his power. I carried that knowledge in my bones like a sickness. As I sat in the back, his voice grew uneven. The lawyers exchanged puzzled glances, wondering why the judge seemed suddenly shaken. But I knew. He saw me, and for the first time in decades, he realized his past wasn't buried deep enough. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I didn't give him anything that might suggest mercy. All I gave him was silence. And silence, I knew, was louder than any accusation. The trial began. People argued over evidence, witnesses gave testimony, and the entire room pretended justice was something pure. But my mind wasn't on the case at hand. I wasn't there for the defendant. I wasn't there for the plaintiff. I was there for him. Every word he spoke, every nervous glance he tried to conceal, fueled the storm inside me. When the recess was called, he lingered at his bench longer than usual. I watched as he shuffled his papers, his hand trembling just enough to betray the mask he wore. He dared not look in my direction again, but I could feel the pull of his awareness, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, pretending the ground beneath him wasn't crumbling. I thought of Emily. The way her laughter used to echo through our old house. The promises I had made at her graveside, promises I had lived every day of my life to keep. And now, here I was, staring down the man who had silenced her truth and walked away unscathed. When he finally stood to leave, he glanced, just once, toward the back of the room. And that's when it happened. His foot caught on the step, a stumble so uncharacteristic it made even the bailiff startle. He caught himself, adjusted his robe, and quickly disappeared through the judge's door. The whispers started immediately. People noticed. They always do when those in power show cracks in their armor. But none of them knew why. None of them knew who I was, or what I carried with me. As the room emptied, I stayed seated. My hands rested calmly on my lap, but inside me, every nerve was burning alive. I had waited for this moment, rehearsed it in my mind for years, but seeing him falter in real time was more intoxicating than I had imagined. Still, this was only the beginning. I hadn't come here to watch him stumble. I had come here to make him fall. And what no one in that courtroom realized, not the lawyers, not the jury, not even Henry Whitaker himself, was that by the end of this trial, his carefully built world would collapse. His silence would betray him. His secrets would bleed into the open. Because I wasn't just there to watch. I was there to deliver the reckoning he never saw coming. But the first crack had already formed, and with it, something far more dangerous stirred. I wasn't the only one watching. And that was when I realized I wasn't the hunter alone. Someone else had their eyes on me, and their reasons were just as dangerous. The game had already begun. The day after the courtroom, I didn't sleep. I walked the city in the small hours, letting the lights and the silence keep me company. Night has a way of peeling people down to their essentials. It strips away the performative kindness and leaves you with whatever you were born with. I walked because motion steadied the tremor that had started in my hands when Judge Whitaker's eyes met mine. Motion kept me honest. Motion kept the memory of Emily from clogging my throat like a rotten thing. Emily was 2 years younger than me, with a mouth that was always unfairly quick to laugh and a stubbornness that had served her well in a world that often tried to make women small. She loved rainy afternoons and the kind of novels that kept you up until dawn. She loved me the way a sibling loves the person who knows all your stupid parts and keeps coming back anyway. We grew up in a house of cracked plaster and good intentions, where our mother stitched together what our father couldn't afford to fix. When Emily finished school, she took a job arranging weddings at a boutique venue downtown. Ironic, given how our family had learned to do love wrong and still survive. She convinced herself the world was mostly kind. I convinced myself I would protect her. The first fracture came in pieces, like hairline cracks across a perfectly still lake. Small things, late-night calls she would brush off, a man's name that made her go quiet when she thought no one was listening, a bruise she explained away with clumsy jokes. She covered the bruises with lipstick and laughter. I told myself I was imagining it. Men do that sometimes. Fixate on a smile and pretend the rest is background. Then the night of the party. It was supposed to be a celebration. The boutique was hosting a showcase of winter arrangements, the kind of small, shiny event our town loved to pretend was important. Emily called me at midnight. Her voice had that brittle, distant air of someone holding themselves together with tape and sugar. "Danny," she said, and for a second I felt everything right again, because she said my name like an anchor. "Come over. I need you." I found her on the kitchen floor of the apartment she shared with a woman named Claire. Claire, who smelled like cheap perfume and had a laugh that always came too early. The place had been turned over, cushions were sliced, a vase lay in shards, and Emily's eyes were twin moons of disbelief. She had been attacked, she said in fragments between sobs. The police came, and they were polite. They asked the right questions in the tone of people who'd seen 1,000 versions of this story and were tired of being surprised. They took photos, wrote notes, and then, because our town is small and official records are comfortable things, they filed it away under the rubric of domestic disturbance. Whitaker's name never appeared in those early reports. His involvement came later, like a slow, corrupting tide. He was in the background of our lives then in the same way vines creep over a fence, unremarkable until you realize they're the only thing left standing. He was a pillar, a man who sat at the apex of every charity gala, who smiled for cameras and gave speeches about moral guardianship and the sanctity of law. People loved him because he had mastered the machinery of respectability. He was the kind of man whose presence could make a clerk's hands shake, the kind whom reporters quoted with reverence. He was also, it turned out, the kind of man who could bury a name if he decided it would be inconvenient. Emily didn't name him that night. She named complications. A client who showed up a little too often, cash that didn't make sense, a favor asked and accepted. It was the kind of confession that feels like a puzzle with one missing piece. She kept trying to say the piece and it never fit the way she expected. Then, a week later, she died in a hospital bed with an official cause tucked into a neat medical report. An accident, they said. Slip, they said. We read the paper and our hands trembled, but the tremor was not from grief alone. The coroner's photographs, when they eventually released them to us, had been edited. The bruise over her eye had been minimized in the images, made to look like nothing. A report from a consultant had pronounced the injuries consistent with a fall. The consultant's signature belonged to a man who had a new job at the county hospital the same year Whitaker secured a grant. At the funeral, Whitaker delivered a eulogy so precise it felt sharpened on purpose. He told stories about Emily's kindness and her love of small things and how the law should always protect the vulnerable. People cried the right number of tears. They clasped my shoulder and told me time heals and to be strong. They meant it. They always did. What they didn't mean, and what they never wanted to mean, was that the man who spoke from the pulpit had anything to do with what had happened. I was 27 when she died. I left town 2 months later with the heat of my anger like a second skin. I changed my name and my number. I took jobs that required long nights and traveling, the sort that teach you to be invisible. I learned how to read people not for the words they used but for the shape their hands made when they lied. I learned how to make a living out of the small grifts that let me sleep without being haunted by the corners of a life I'd left behind. People call it running. I called it strategy. I told myself that one day I'd have a map to go back to the place where they thought the past was over. There are things you can live without and things you can't. Emily's laugh was not something I could place on a shelf and forget. So I mapped Whitaker's life in the margins of my own. I watched the cycles of his public appearances, the charity luncheons, the gala speeches, the quiet dinners. I learned his patterns, what hotels he frequented, which bank handled his accounts, the clerk who always looked flummoxed after his calls. I found the seams of his respectability, where the polish didn't meet the grain. It became a project, obsessively beautiful and terrible, and in the quiet of my nights I stitched those seams into something that would one day tear him open. But obsession is a lonely room, and the place where I slept was full of faces who kept proving that cruelty could be more mundane than monstrous. My closest ally was a woman named Rosa, a small-time paralegal I met in a courthouse cafe 2 years after Emily's funeral. She had eyes like a ledger, sharp, precise, and incapable of forgetting a small slight. Rosa had once been engaged to a prosecutor who ended up being a convenient scapegoat in an ethics scandal. She learned then that institutions protect themselves first and people second. When I told her my story, when I told enough of it for her to understand what I intended, she did not recoil. She made coffee, and she began to draw lines on a napkin that would become a map of Whitaker's hidden investments, his small favors, the men who did his dirty work. She had a collection of clerks' notes and an appetite for truth that felt like the only thing in the world more honest than grief. It was Rosa who taught me how to get a file without asking permission. "There's always a copy," she told me, smiling like she'd swallowed a secret, "if you know where to look." So we looked. We found purchase orders, receipts for donations that never reached their supposed causes, and a string of small charities that existed only on paper and fed money into shadow accounts. We found, folded deep in a drawer, an envelope with a hospital consultant's name, one I recognized because the man's signature matched that botched medical report from Emily's death. That was my small discovery. A slip that had been overlooked, a maintenance log from the boutique where Emily had worked, a payroll entry, and under it, almost as an afterthought, a note in Whitaker's handwriting about clearing an issue. The note was brief and benign on its face, but it trembled with the implication that whispered truths around town refused to say aloud. Why would the judge be clearing an issue about a boutique's payroll unless the boutique mattered to someone he favored? Why would his handwriting appear in mundane financial records unless he had reasons he wanted to hide? Rosa and I spent nights going over these scraps, laying them like bones on a table until a skeleton formed. Each piece suggested Whitaker's reach, his ability to move a problem from one hand to another without making a mess. He never had to soil his own hands. He had the town's machinery and its people to do that for him. And every time we moved a piece along the board, I felt something in me that had been coiled for years uncurl into a plan. I wanted to believe in a single villain. The world, I discovered, rarely gives you such neatness. It gives you systems, networks of bargains and quiet compromises. Whitaker wasn't a single evil, he was the node in a network. He had friends who helped him bury things and men who would accept small payments to turn their heads. He had a prosecutor who liked Whitaker's advice and a coroner who took favors as a matter of course. He had enough hands in different places that when one tried to reach for a truth, another could close over it. The more we found, the more dangerous our work became. People notice when you start testing foundations. An old clerk would cough in my presence. A waitress would ask me a question about a file I hadn't asked for in a tone full of too many meanings. I kept waiting for the moment someone would stare at me and see the man I had been: angry, reckless, raw. Instead, the first person who noticed was the least likely, a girl working the 3rd floor of the county archives. She slid a rolled-up newspaper across the table to me without looking up and said, "You dropped this." It was a small thing, an unremarkable kindness. She had the kind of face that made you feel seen, as if she understood the geometry of grief. When I unrolled the paper later that night, there, between the business section and an obituary, was a photograph of Whitaker. He was smiling, handing a check to a charity I hadn't seen on any of his public schedules. The caption mentioned a confidential donor. Someone had written on the margin of that clipping, in cramped, hurried script, "Check the handwriting on the grant memo." That scrawl was enough. It was the kind of breadcrumb a tired person leaves themselves, a nudge for the morning after. It suggested that somewhere, someone had tried to hide something and then, in the swirl of their busy life, had left a trail back to them. It was the first sign that our little investigation might be answering back. I kept that clipping folded in the back pocket of my jacket. I slept with it like a talisman. It was nothing and everything. A single photograph, a margin note, the possibility of a connection. On my last night in that city before I returned, before I changed my name, before the careful disappearance, someone followed me home. I saw the shadow early, a reflection a half-second later in the glass of a shop window. I felt the presence in the kind of way you feel a draft in a closed room. Adrenaline is a precise thing. It removes the fog and leaves you with a fine, focused edge. I turned a corner in a way that made the follow stop and then continue, uncertain. I waited beneath a streetlight, and when the figure finally drew close enough to step into the light, I recognized him. A man I'd seen at charity auctions, an older fellow named Mercer whose pleasant face made people think of grandfatherly things. Mercer had been on a committee Whitaker chaired. He looked at me like a man expecting a compliment. Instead, I smiled and said, "You know my sister." He stopped, and his smile died like someone turned off a lamp. "I'm sorry," he said. "Emily," I said. My voice was low, the way it lands when something heavy must be carried carefully. "You were at the boutique the night she—" Mercer's hands went to his coat as if to check for a wallet. He shifted his weight, and for a moment I thought he would run. Instead he leaned in and said, "You should leave this town, Daniel. Sometimes people dig where they should bury." He had called me by the name I had, at that time, still used. The city had ears, and whatever network Whitaker ran had more than the judge's reach. It told me two things at once, that my past wasn't as buried as I'd hoped, and that there were people willing to warn me in gentle, threatening ways. I could have hit him. I could have made a scene. Instead I nodded, because there are moments when violence only proves the point of the threat, and I had bigger needs than a fist. I left the city the next morning. I changed my name, because the world is kinder to ghosts who speak in new languages. I swore I would come back when I had the map to do something besides look. I promised myself that Emily's face wouldn't be the only thing I carried forward. I promised that when I returned, it would be to dismantle the architecture that had let her die and be called an accident. When I returned to town last week and sat in that courtroom, I didn't expect Whitaker to falter so visibly. I expected him to be composed, a man who had learned the art of smoothing out the ripples his life made. But the stumble told me something else, that whatever skeletons I thought I'd found might already be rattling in the wrong closets. And if Whitaker had woken to the possibility that I was not the man he'd been able to ignore for years, then someone else had woken too, someone who had reasons to keep both of us under watch. Rosa called me the night after the hearing. Her voice was thin with exhaustion and something I couldn't name. "There's someone asking about you," she said. "They came to the office. Didn't say much, but they asked about Daniel Cole." My name felt like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples reached farther than I'd intended. "Did they leave a card?" I asked. "No," she said. "They left a calling card." I asked what it looked like. She described a simple piece of cardstock, the kind of businesslike thing that felt more like a threat than a courtesy. On it, printed in small, exact letters, was a single sentence: "We remember." When she said that, I felt the cold of the room close in, and for the first time since Emily died, I realized that the past might be wider than I'd thought. The map I had been sketching in the margins might already be an inhabited place. I folded the clipping into my palm until it left a crease and held on to the crease like something I could use to find my way back. Outside, rain began to fall in the thin, persistent way it does when a city is trying to scrub itself clean. I wanted to believe it could be clean again. I wanted to believe truth could move like water and carve new patterns through old stone. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. No message. The call lasted 3 seconds before it died. In the silence that followed, I realized the game had changed. Whoever had left that card wanted me named, noticed, and afraid. Whoever had called had the means to reach me across years and borders. I sat very still in the dark and let the memory of Emily's laugh roll through me like a tide. I had sworn I would not be the man who screamed into the void and let the void swallow him. I had sworn I would make noise that could not be shrugged off. The rain outside came harder. The lights in the street reflected the wet like tarnished coins. And then, beneath the sound of the storm, a small, deliberate knock came at my door, 3 slow, measured raps. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying. I hadn't given my new address to anyone outside Rosa. The knock made the promise I'd been holding begin to feel dangerously thin. I reached for the phone, then set it down. There are moments when you know the choice you are about to make will change everything. I slid the deadbolt and placed my palm against the wood of the door, feeling the grain under my skin like a pulse. When the door opened a sliver, a voice said, in perfect, careful tones I recognized from 1,000 speeches and eulogies, "Mr. Cole. It's time we had a conversation about Emily." The voice froze me in place. It was too familiar, too precise, as though every syllable had been weighed before it left his mouth. Judge Henry Whitaker stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house where I had been living under a borrowed name, his black coat buttoned against the rain, his eyes sharp despite the hour. He did not look like a man who had come to plead. He looked like a man who had come to reclaim control. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, that exhaustion and memory had conjured him. But the rain dripping from his coat onto the floor was real. The faint cologne I remembered from the funeral years ago was real. The flicker of recognition in his eyes, the same look I had seen in court when he froze, was real. "May I come in?" he asked, voice steady, though his fingers twitched once at his side. I didn't answer. I opened the door just enough for him to step in and then locked it behind him. My hand hovered near the chair by the table, where a folded pocket knife lay hidden beneath some papers. He noticed the motion and gave a faint smile, the kind that said he knew how to read the room. "You've been following me," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "No," he said, removing his gloves one finger at a time. "I've been watching. There's a difference." The audacity in his words pressed against my chest. Watching. As if all these years of silence had been some magnanimous decision on his part. As if Emily's death and the buried reports were things he had simply monitored rather than orchestrated. He walked slowly around the small room, his eyes landing on the folded newspaper clipping on the table, the one with the charity photograph. His lips pressed together, and for the first time I saw something shift, just a flicker, but enough. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel," he said. "You've built yourself a new life. A quiet life. I would hate to see you ruin it." The way he said it wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was pity dressed as power. I leaned forward. "You ruined it when you buried her." He stopped moving. His back was to me, but I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly as if weighing his next words like evidence in a trial. "You think you know what happened," he said, still not facing me. "But the truth is never as clean as you want it to be. Sometimes justice means choosing which stories survive." I felt my chest tighten. "You mean which stories you kill?" He turned then, and his face was pale, drawn tight around the mouth. For a long moment we just stared at each other, two men bound by the same ghost. "I can protect you," he said finally, lowering his voice. "From the people you don't even realize are looking at you now. Walk away, Daniel. Leave this city again. It's the only way you survive." That was the breadcrumb. Not in his words, but in what he didn't say. His fear wasn't of me, it was of someone else. Someone with reach. Someone who had sent that calling card to Rose's office. "You're afraid," I said. "Not of me. Of them." His silence confirmed it. When he left, he didn't slam the door. He closed it with the same deliberate precision he used when bringing down a gavel. But the air he left behind felt poisoned, as though the walls themselves had heard a secret too dangerous to contain. That night I barely slept. His warning echoed through me like a second heartbeat. Who was watching me, and why would Whitaker, of all people, suddenly care whether I lived or died? The next morning, Rosa called again. Her tone was clipped, urgent. "Daniel, listen to me carefully. I found something. The grant memo the newspaper clipping mentioned, the handwriting matches. It's Whitaker's. But the funds? They didn't go to the charity. They went into a trust. And the beneficiary, it wasn't Emily, but someone connected to her." "Who?" I asked. "Claire," she said. "Her old roommate." My stomach dropped. Claire, the one with the perfume, the brittle laugh, the roommate who had vanished after Emily's funeral. I hadn't thought about her in years. And now her name was written into Whitaker's ledger. Why would he funnel money toward her? To buy silence? To erase a witness? Or was she part of something larger, something Emily had discovered before she died? I went to the boutique where Emily used to work, now closed and boarded up. Dust clung to the windows, but through the cracks I could see remnants, an overturned chair, a half-faded mural of flowers. I pressed my forehead to the glass, and in the reflection, I caught sight of a figure across the street. Watching me. It wasn't Whitaker. It was Mercer, the man from the city who had warned me once before. His eyes met mine, and this time he didn't look away. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in warning, and then he disappeared into the crowd. Something was unraveling faster than I could follow. Whitaker wasn't just a corrupt judge covering his tracks. He was part of something deeper, something that reached into Emily's life in ways I still didn't understand. And the more I pulled, the more dangerous it became. That night, I sat by the window of my room, the city's neon glow spilling across the floor, and I recorded a message on my phone. My voice was steady, but underneath, it trembled with the weight of what I was uncovering. If you've been following this story, I said, speaking as if someone was already listening, don't look away. Because the truth isn't just about me, or even about Emily. It's about the lies people like Whitaker build, the kind of lies that bury people alive. And if you want to know how deep it goes, stay with me. Like this. Share it. Don't let them erase her again. I saved the recording, but I didn't post it yet. Not until I had more. Not until I had proof. Because proof was the only weapon left to me. And proof, I was about to discover, was closer than I thought. Hidden in a place I never expected, waiting to cut Whitaker open once and for all. But to find it, I would have to follow Claire. And Claire had vanished for a reason. I woke the next morning with a knot in my stomach. The kind of knot that doesn't loosen no matter how deeply you breathe. The storm that had been building quietly in the corners of my life was about to crack open, and I could feel it. Something told me I was close, too close to something dangerous to ignore, too close to something that could break me if I wasn't ready. But there's a strange clarity that comes when you finally accept that the truth will hurt either way. I wasn't running anymore. The day unfolded like any other at first, which almost made it worse. I went through the motions, coffee, shower, bus ride to the courthouse, but everything was sharper. Every sound seemed amplified, every face I passed suspicious. I replayed the exchange with Judge Sterling in my head 1,000 times. That flicker in his eyes when he saw me, the way his voice had trembled ever so slightly before he recovered. It wasn't my imagination. That man knew me, or at least knew something about me, and he was hiding it. Inside the courthouse, the air was as cold as ever. The sharp click of heels echoed off the marble floors, clerks shuffling papers, the dull murmur of lawyers discussing strategy. I kept my head down, clutching my case file tighter than necessary, but inside I was buzzing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into the jaws of something I had been running from my entire life. When I finally stepped into the courtroom, Sterling was already seated, flipping through his notes with studied calm. His expression was perfectly neutral, almost too neutral. The moment his gaze lifted and locked on mine, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. His eyes lingered a fraction too long, and in that silence between us, I understood. He remembered. Not just me, my past. I sat down, my pulse hammering in my throat. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began the proceedings like nothing was out of place. But I couldn't focus on the words. Every syllable felt distant, blurred by the weight of what had just passed between us. The way his fingers gripped the bench, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room, this was not the calm authority of a man in control. This was someone wrestling with recognition he didn't want. It was in that moment that a memory I had buried clawed its way back to the surface. A night long ago, when I was barely 15. The slam of a gavel, the booming voice of a judge sentencing someone I loved. My father, his wrists cuffed, his eyes full of fire even as they dragged him away. And that voice, it was the same voice I was hearing now, softened by age but unmistakable. Judge Sterling had been there. He wasn't just part of my present, he was the architect of my past. The man who had torn my family apart. My throat went dry. I wanted to leap up, to shout the memory into the room and demand answers, but I forced myself to stay seated. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. Rage had to wait. Revenge, if it was coming, had to be precise. During the recess, I stayed back while everyone else filed out. Sterling gathered his papers slowly, deliberately avoiding my eyes. I couldn't resist. My voice came out low, almost steady. You remember me, don't you? His hand froze on the edge of the file. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he glanced up, his mask slipping just enough to show the fear beneath. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Just silence. A silence that confirmed everything I needed to know. I left the courtroom trembling, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of certainty. The truth was undeniable now. Sterling wasn't just a judge presiding over my case. He was a ghost from my past, a man who had shaped the very course of my life, a man who thought his role in my story had been buried forever. But ghosts don't stay buried. Not when I'm the one digging. And as I walked out into the sharp afternoon light, one thought burned hotter than all the rest. He may have judged my family once, but now it was my turn to judge him. The question was, how? I knew then that I would have to play carefully, because what came next would not just expose him, it would shatter the ground he stood on. And I was ready to strike. But what I didn't know was that he was already preparing his own move. The first sign that Sterling wasn't going to take this quietly came sooner than I expected. 2 days after our silent confrontation in the courtroom, I received an unmarked envelope slid beneath my apartment door. No return address. No handwriting on the front. Just my name printed in block letters, sharp and cold. Inside was a single page. No greeting, no signature. Just a sentence that made my blood run cold. You don't want the past dragged into the light. Neither do I. Let's keep it that way. It was meant as a warning. A threat dressed as a truce. The kind of message meant to keep me still, to freeze me in place with fear. But instead it did the opposite. For the first time, I knew beyond doubt that Sterling was hiding something big enough to risk everything to protect. And if he was trying this hard to silence me, then exposing him wasn't just revenge anymore. It was survival. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the note, replaying his expression in the courtroom. The mask of calm cracking, the flash of recognition. The truth was so close I could almost taste it. But going head-to-head with a man like Sterling meant one thing: he would use every ounce of power he had to crush me before I could speak. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with a different kind of determination. I wasn't the scared 15-year-old who had watched my father be dragged away. I wasn't the young man hiding in shadows, running from memories I didn't understand. I was here now, and I wasn't backing down. The session began as usual, Sterling presiding with that same hollow authority, his gavel tapping against the wood. But underneath the surface, the tension between us was electric. He avoided my eyes now, almost too deliberately, like he was afraid of what might slip if we locked gazes again. When the hearing broke for recess, I didn't wait for him to approach me. I stood, gathered my papers, and spoke loudly enough for the nearby attorneys and clerks to hear. Interesting, isn't it, Judge Sterling? How small the world can be. How past and present have a way of colliding. The room stilled. Heads turned. His hand, mid-motion, froze against the bench. For a second, his composure faltered, and I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. That was the first crack. By the time the recess ended, whispers had already begun. I caught the looks, the curious glances passed between lawyers and clerks. Sterling knew it too. The courtroom is a place where silence is fragile. Once you drop a single stone, the ripples spread. That night, I doubled down. I dug into every record I could find, tracing back to the trial that had ruined my family. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Sterling hadn't just been the judge. He had personal ties to the case. Conflicts of interest buried in old paperwork, decisions that looked less like justice and more like execution. I knew then what I had to do. I would expose him, but not in the shadows, not behind closed doors. It had to be public. It had to be undeniable. So I waited for the next hearing, my heart hammering as I stepped into the courtroom packed tighter than usual. Word had spread. People wanted to see what would happen. I stood, cleared my throat, and with every ounce of strength I had, I let my voice carry. Your Honor, before this proceeding continues, I have a matter that demands to be addressed. You see, this isn't the first time we've met. You knew my father. You judged him. You destroyed him. And now, here you are, sitting in judgment over me as if the past can't speak. The silence that followed was deafening. Every face turned toward me, shock rippling through the room. Sterling's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the gavel. For the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked cornered. Order, he barked, his voice louder than necessary, cracking at the edges. This is irrelevant. Sit down immediately. But the damage was done. The whispers swelled, lawyers leaning into each other, clerks exchanging wide-eyed glances. The courtroom wasn't Sterling's sanctuary anymore. It was a stage, and I had just lit the fire in front of everyone. And as I met his gaze, I saw it clear as day. Fear. Real, unmasked fear. I knew then that I had shifted the balance. Sterling would fight back, harder and dirtier than before. But for the first time, I wasn't the one playing catch-up. I had him exactly where I wanted him. The courthouse felt like a battlefield the morning the showdown began. I could feel the eyes on me as soon as I stepped inside, curious, cautious, hungry for the kind of spectacle that usually happens only in movies. Rumors had spread fast after my outburst. Some said I was Sterling's illegitimate child. Others swore I had uncovered a scandal buried for decades. None of them knew the truth, not yet. But the whispers had already weakened him, and in a courtroom, weakness spreads like blood in water. Sterling walked in a few minutes later, flanked by his clerks. His robe was pressed crisp, his jaw locked so tight I could almost hear his teeth grinding. But his eyes betrayed him, red-rimmed, restless. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, a man wrestling with ghosts clawing at the inside of his skull. He struck the gavel harder than usual, the sound ricocheting off the wood-paneled walls. "This court will come to order," he announced, his voice sharp but strained. I sat straighter, hands folded on the table in front of me, my case file a shield I no longer needed. I wasn't there just to defend myself anymore. I was there to expose him, to drag his secrets into the light. And I could feel the room vibrating with the same anticipation that thrummed inside me. The first hour passed in tense motions and procedural arguments, Sterling cutting me off every time I spoke, overruling objections with curt finality. It was obvious what he was doing, trying to silence me, trying to prove that he was still in control. But with each dismissal, the room grew heavier with unease. Even the other attorneys noticed the way he leaned too hard on the gavel, the way his voice cracked when I said my father's name. Finally, when the silence between us felt unbearable, I stood. My hands shook, but my voice was steady. "Your Honor, I move to enter into the record new evidence regarding a conflict of interest in the case you presided over 15 years ago. The case of Samuel Hayes, my father." The room froze. Sterling's head snapped up, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For a moment, he looked less like a judge and more like a man caught in the glare of oncoming headlights. I laid the documents on the table with deliberate care. Copies of transcripts, records of financial ties, details that linked him to the prosecution in ways that should have disqualified him from ever sitting on that bench. I had found the breadcrumbs, and now I was laying the trail for everyone to see. The other lawyers leaned forward, their eyes wide. The clerks exchanged looks, pens hovering over paper. Even the gallery, usually a restless shuffle of spectators, was silent. Sterling's hand trembled as he gripped the gavel. "This is irrelevant," he barked, though his voice cracked on the last word. "This is an abuse of the court." "No," I interrupted, my voice rising above his for the first time. "This is justice. You destroyed my father's life to protect your own ties. You judged him guilty before the trial even began. And now you want to do the same to me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sterling slammed the gavel again and again, each strike more desperate than the last. "Order! I will not tolerate this." But the more he shouted, the smaller he looked. His robe hung heavy on him now, no longer a symbol of power but a shroud. The gallery erupted into whispers, the press at the back scribbling furiously. And then it happened. His mask cracked. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, but the microphone carried it across the room. "You don't know what you're talking about." But I did. Everyone did now. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Then prove me wrong. Deny it under oath. Look me in the eye and swear that you didn't condemn my father for reasons you never admitted. Swear that you were impartial." Sterling's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes darted left and right, desperate for escape, for something to cling to. The silence stretched, suffocating, until finally he lowered his gaze. And in that silence, he lost everything. The gallery erupted. Lawyers muttered under their breath, reporters rushed out the door, clerks whispering as if history had just cracked open before them. The man who had ruled with cold authority for decades had been undone not by a jury, not by evidence alone, but by the simple truth he could no longer deny. For me, it was a quiet victory, one that settled deep in my chest rather than exploding in triumph. The man who had once destroyed my family had finally been stripped bare. Not by violence, not by rage, but by the weight of his own silence. But even as I sat there, the adrenaline fading, I knew this wasn't over. The system doesn't crumble in a day. Sterling still had power, still had allies, still had claws. He would fight in the shadows now, desperate to drag me down with him. The war wasn't finished, but the battle had finally turned. And as I left the courtroom, my heart steady for the first time in years, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real reckoning, the one that would decide everything, was still waiting for me just around the corner. The storm finally broke on a gray morning that smelled of rain and paper. By then, the courthouse had become less a place of law and more a stage for ruin. Every day I walked through those doors, the whispers followed me. Reporters hovered near the steps like vultures, snapping photographs of a judge who no longer walked tall, and of me, the ghost who had risen from the past to haunt him. Sterling tried, in those last days, to claw his way back. He filed motions, dismissed hearings, even called in favors with colleagues who owed him their careers. But power built on silence doesn't survive noise, and the noise was deafening now. Every journalist in the city had their teeth sunk into the old transcripts, the financial records, the photographs of him shaking hands with men he later judged. His name was no longer spoken with respect but with suspicion, with venom. The hearing that sealed his fate was nothing short of surreal. The courtroom was packed tighter than I'd ever seen, every seat taken, people standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Sterling entered not as a judge, but as a man summoned to answer. He wore no robe that day, just a dark suit that seemed to hang loose on his frame. He looked older, smaller, as if the truth had eaten away at him from the inside. When he took the stand, the silence was thick enough to choke on. I watched him, waiting for the bluster, the denial, the arrogance I had come to expect. But it didn't come. His voice, when it finally broke the air, was hollow. I made decisions, years ago, decisions I cannot undo. He didn't confess everything, not directly. Men like Sterling rarely do. But it was enough. Enough to show the world that what I had carried for so long was not madness, not vengeance twisted from memory. It was truth. Cold, unyielding truth. When the gavel fell, it wasn't in his hand. It was in another judge's, striking the final note of Sterling's career, his reputation, his carefully constructed empire of control. The sound echoed, and I felt something shift inside me. A chain I'd been dragging since I was 15 finally snapped free. I walked out of that courtroom into a drizzle that felt almost cleansing. Reporters shouted my name, microphones thrust toward me, but their voices were distant, muffled, as though I were walking underwater. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of silence. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window and let the rain fall against the glass. I thought of my father, of the way his eyes had burned with both fury and love as they dragged him away. I thought of the years I had lived in shadow, afraid of a truth that was never mine to bear alone. And I thought of Sterling, a man who had once held a gavel like it was the word of God, now reduced to a whisper fading into obscurity. I realized then that revenge isn't fire. It isn't the explosion we imagine when we dream of payback. It's quieter. It's the steady erosion of a wall until the stones collapse under their own weight. It's the moment you stop needing their destruction and start living in your own freedom. To those of you who have walked with me through this story, know this: silence is never harmless. It grows roots. It corrodes. And the longer you bury truth, the louder it echoes when it finally rises. If this story has struck something in you, if you've ever felt the weight of injustice pressing against your chest, I ask you, don't carry it alone. Share this journey, like this video. Subscribe so more stories like mine can find the light they deserve. Because we are not just survivors of the past. We are witnesses. We are the ones who choose whether silence becomes a weapon or whether it becomes the soil where something new can grow. And as I closed my eyes that night, the rain still tapping gently against the glass, I understood something I had never let myself believe. Roots heal in silence too, if you let them.